Welcome to the exhibit!
The story of Highlander in Hearthstone begins in the League of Explorers with Reno Jackson, a card which reads, Battle Cry, if your deck has no duplicates, fully heal your hero. This effect is obviously very powerful, and this was the card that started it all. The overall metagame at the time was much slower than it is in both Standard and Wild in modern Hearthstone. There were very few decks that would be looking to kill you on turn 6 or 7, the notable exceptions being Aggro Shaman and Secret Paladin. Against any other decks, Reno would almost always have been drawn well before you wanted to play it, often not being played until after turn 10. This was the slowest meta in which Highlander had a place, and as such, there was a relatively unique situation in play, where some decks would include 2 copies of a couple of their most impactful cards. The Highlander effect only checked the deck at the time when the card was played, not at the beginning of the game. Because of this fact, and the slower nature of the meta, it was possible to include 2 copies of 1 or 2 key cards in your deck, and usually have drawn one of the 2 copies of those cards before you needed to play Reno, meaning that the Reno effect would go off anyway. This phenomenon would fade away over the years, as the metagame in general became more aggressive, and the general card quality of the game increased. In the earliest iterations of Highlander decks, a pure Highlander list would often have to include some very questionable cards to meet the no duplicates requirement. And with the game releasing more and more powerful cards as time went on, this became less and less of an issue. Reno Jackson saw use in multiple classes over the course of its run in Standard, with Reno Warlock being the most notable early adopter of the card, and many other decks springing up over the course of its run. In Wild, Reno Jackson is still included in every Highlander deck that sees play. The effect is just extremely powerful, and the card has become iconic for Highlander decks in the format. The Mean Streets of Gadgetzan would introduce several new Highlander cards for Priest, Mage and Warlock, in the form of Raza the Chained, Inkmaster Solia, and Krul the Unshackled, as well as Kazakus, which could be used in any of the 3 classes. Let's start off with Kazakus, as he was available to all 3 classes. This card was simply an auto-include in any Highlander deck for Priest, Mage or Warlock. The custom potion which the card generated was extremely flexible, offering powerful effects at 1, 5 and 10 mana, with the strength of the effect scaling with the mana cost chosen. The possible effects were: deal X damage to all minions, give your minions plus X health, deal X damage, freeze X random enemy minions, summon X friendly minions that died this game, draw X cards, transform either a random enemy minion or all enemy minions into 1/1 sheep. This option was only available at 5 or 10 cost. Summon an XX demon, add X random demons to your hand, and finally gain X armor. The player would be offered a choice of 3 of these effects at a time, followed by a choice of a different 3 for a total of 2 effects on the custom potion. Needless to say, this card was extremely flexible, and could do pretty much anything that you wanted it to do if you got offered the right options. While in Standard, the card saw play in any Highlander deck for the 3 classes that it was available in. In Wild, the card still sees play in any Highlander deck for Priest, Mage or Warlock. Its flexibility is just extremely powerful, and very few other cards offer as much value as it does for just a single card. Next up is Inkmaster Solia. The card wasn't great, especially at its inception. The effect simply wasn't good enough to justify running a Highlander list in Mage, especially when other classes had received markedly better offerings. The card did see some experimentation in a big spell mage list, which gained some popularity in Standard later down the line during Kobolds and Catacombs, but the card was by no means a key player in that deck. The card faded into obscurity relatively quickly, and saw little to no play in Wild, even at the times when Highlander Mage saw some level of popularity, like the early Ashes of Outland Wild meta. Krul the Unshackled had a similar fate to Solia. The effect was good, but it required you to have a lot of demons in hand for it to be effective. At its inception, there simply weren't very many good demons available in Standard, so although the effect looked very strong, it very rarely got to bring its full potential into reality. Later on, in Kobolds and Catacombs, a very strong demon was printed in the form of Voidlord, which you would think would have made this card much better, but unfortunately Kobolds also brought with it Possessed Lackey and Skull of the Minari, which were strictly better demon cheating options in many cases. The previous expansion to Kobolds, Knights of the Frozen Throne, had also introduced Bloodreaver Gul'dan, which resummoned any friendly demons which had died this game, often simply being a better final board push than Krul, as you didn't have to keep the demons in hand for multiple turns to set up for the effect. There were of course some very greedy decks which included both Bloodreaver Gul'dan and Krul, but these saw very little success. Overall, the card never really made its mark on the game, as by the time cards were introduced which allowed it to shine, there were also already better options to synergize with those cards. The card saw some experimentation throughout its time in Standard, then faded to obscurity in Wild with no notable resurgences that I know of. The final Highlander card introduced with Mean Streets of Gadgetzan was Raza the Chained, and believe me, I've saved the best for last. This card was extremely powerful, enabling a 0 mana hero power for Priest, and incentivizing Priest to pick up the Highlander archetype alongside existing cards like Reno and Kazakus. The archetype had plenty of success as a control deck in Standard during Mean Streets, and was relatively unaffected by the rotation of Reno during Journey to Un'Goro due to their new quest Awaken the Makers, which fulfilled the same role as Reno Jackson in the deck, alongside the new card Lyra the Sunshard, which allowed the deck to generate a lot of value off of only a single card, due to Priest's many low-cost spells. The deck would be taken to the next level during Knights of the Frozen Throne with Shadow Reaper Anduin. The 0-cost hero power from Kazakus persisted through the playing of Shadow Reaper Anduin, so you had a 0-cost hero power that refreshed whenever the priest played a card, alongside Lyra, which allowed you to potentially generate a lot of low-cost spells. The deck was extremely good and saw play in both Standard and Wild at this time for its strong combo turns, often dealing upwards of 10 damage with just the Shadow Reaper Anduin hero power. In Wild, these combo turns were augmented by Spawn of Shadows, a card which had flown under the radar up until this point, which dealt 4 damage to both players whenever the priest used their hero power. This card pushed the combo from just dealing high damage to performing a 1-turn kill reasonably often. Raza the Chained became the first Highlander card to be nerfed during Kobolds and Catacombs, which changed the hero power to costing 1 mana rather than 0, significantly reducing the amount of hero powers that could be used in a single turn. The deck was still good in Standard and playable in Wild, but nowhere near the meta-defining force that it had been. You would think that the story would end here, but during Descent of Dragons, Raza was reverted to its original state as it rotated to Wild. This immediately put the deck back into Tier 1, and it has stayed there ever since, with more Highlander cards and generally strong Priest cards being added down the line to further augment the combo aspect of the deck. Highlander Priest is still one of the meta decks to beat in Wild, even after all this time. Raza the Chained is undoubtedly the Highlander card which has had the greatest impact on the game so far. With the release of Rise of Shadows and the start of the Year of the Dragon, all existing Highlander cards would rotate out of Standard, leaving Highlander as a Wild-only archetype for a few months. But the archetype would return in a big way in Saviours of Uldum. Saviours of Uldum gave us Zephrys, Sir Finley of the Sands, Elise the Enlightened, Reno the Relicologist, and Dinotamer Brann, the most Highlander cards ever introduced in a single set. Let's start with Zephrys, since he is the only neutral card in the group. Zephrys was obviously good. Similar to Kazakus, he was extremely flexible, and would always offer you a choice of cards which were powerful in your current situation. He was also cheaper than Kazakus at 2 mana, making him the cheapest Highlander card printed so far, alongside Sir Finley of the Sands. This was a big advantage for the card, as it meant that the cards which Zephrys offered would often be playable using all of your remaining mana, so the card itself costing less was a big deal to enable more powerful cards to be offered from it. The card was and continues to be an auto-include in any Highlander deck, standard or wild, just for the flexibility that it provides. Some decks would even include the card in a normal deck with a high amount of card draw, simply aiming to play a lot of their deck and then make use of the card in the late game once their deck contained no more duplicates. The only deck that Sir Finley of the Sands saw play in initially was one such deck. Prismatic Lens Paladin made use of Tip the Scales alongside Prismatic Lens and a lot of cheap Murlocs to cast a heavily reduced Tip the Scales on turn 5 and generate a massive board of Murlocs. The deck was not a Highlander deck, but it did include Sir Finley of the Sands and Zephrys because they burned through the contents of their deck so quickly, often allowing the Highlander cards to be played later in the game to generate value. Sir Finley of the Sands was also a reasonably statted Murloc, so he wasn't too bad to pull from Tip the Scales. Unfortunately, this is just about the only good deck that Sir Finley of the Sands saw any play in. He simply wasn't good enough to promote a Highlander archetype to take root in Paladin, as you did not get the upgraded hero power until you played Sir Finley. If the effect had been a start of game effect, perhaps history would be much kinder to this card, but as he stands, the card was unfortunately not good enough and saw pretty much no play in Standard or Wild after the Prismatic Lens Tip the Scales deck faded away relatively early into the expansion. Elise the Enlightened saw relatively little play in Saviors of Uldum and the following expansions, but did see a little bit of a renaissance much later on in its standard run, with Reno Druid becoming somewhat of a popular archetype later in the Madness at the Darkmoon Fair meta. Elise the Enlightened found a place in that deck, mainly to duplicate key power cards like Ysera Unleashed and Yogg-Saron, Master of Fate. The card wasn't insanely good, but it did see some experimentation and inclusion in a few reasonable decks over the course of its standard run. The card unfortunately simply isn't good enough to promote Reno Druid as an archetype in Wild, as the class has access to some much better archetypes, namely Token Druid and Jade Druid. Reno the Relicologist also found very little success in Standard during Saviors of Uldum, but would be helped significantly by a general increase in card quality during Descent of Dragons, with both Malygos Aspect of Magic and Dragonqueen Alexstrasza helping the viability of Reno Mage significantly by giving it access to endgame win conditions. The effect of the card itself of dealing 10 damage randomly split among all enemy minions is certainly good enough to see inclusion in any existing Highlander deck, but not good enough to justify building a Highlander deck just to enable this card. After Descent of Dragons, the card continued to see play in Highlander Mage for the entirety of its standard run, and continues to see play in Wild whenever Reno Mage becomes a meta-relevant deck. Dinotamer Brann was the final Highlander card of Saviors of Uldum, and arguably the strongest, as it would go on to become the second Highlander card to be nerfed by order of introduction, although chronologically it would be nerfed third after Dragonqueen Alexstrasza. The card costs 7 mana for a 2/4 body, and read, Battlecry, if your deck contains no duplicates, summon King Crush. King Crush was a pretty bad card when it was introduced in Classic at 9 mana, but a 2 mana reduction was significant, alongside a second body with 2/4 worth of stats. Highlander Hunter became one of the strongest meta decks in both Standard and Wild off of the back of this card. The quality of cards in Hunter was reasonably high in Zephrys of Uldum, and only became higher in later expansions, with cards like Hyena Alpha, Phase Stalker, Pack Tactics, Open the Cages and Rinling's Rifle enabling a strong aggressive secret package in Highlander Hunter, alongside strong value generation with Zephrys, and another late game win condition with the later edition of Dragonqueen Alexstrasza. Dinotamer Brann would eventually be nerfed towards the midpoint of Madness at the Darkmoon Fair, as the deck had continued to be the predominant Hunter archetype since its inception. The deck was still playable in Standard after the nerf, but became significantly weaker in Wild. The card was unnerfed only 3 months later as it rotated to Wild, but the Reno Hunter archetype never really returned to the Wild meta, with aggressive variants instead being favoured over the more mid-range focus of Dinotamer Brann. Dinotamer Brann is in a weird spot, as it is the only one of the Highlander cards introduced in Zephrys of Uldum which represented a win condition itself rather than a support card. Unfortunately, that win condition isn't strong enough to survive in the extremely fast Wild meta, although it was good enough to flourish in Standard. It's for this reason that Dinotamer Brann sees less play in Wild than a support card like Reno the Relicologist, despite being a stronger card overall. The last piece of the Highlander puzzle so far would be released in Descent of Dragons, in the form of Dragonqueen Alexstrasza. The card read, Battlecry. If your deck has no duplicates, add 2 random dragons to your hand. They cost 0. When initially released, this included Alexstrasza herself as an option for the cards that could be generated, which due to the relatively small pool of dragons would actually happen reasonably often. This would be changed only a month later to instead read other dragons, excluding Alexstrasza herself from the pool, alongside a similar change to other cards which could potentially generate themselves. The card was extremely strong and was an auto-include in any existing Highlander decks, both in Standard and in Wild. It even encouraged some classes with no other Highlander support in Standard except Alexstrasza and Zephrys to experiment with the Highlander archetype, such as Rogue and later Demon Hunter when it was released in Ashes of Outland. The card would be nerfed again towards the end of Ashes of Outland, reducing the randomly generated dragons to 1 cost rather than 0. This was a significant reduction in power level, which pretty much killed off standard Highlander decks in classes without other Highlander support. But the card was still strong in existing Highlander archetypes like Mage and Hunter, and remained popular in wild Highlander archetypes as well. When it came time for Alexstrasza to rotate to Wild, the card was partially reverted, so that the random dragons cost 0 rather than 1, but it remained unable to generate copies of itself. The card still sees play in most Wild Highlander decks. It rarely functions as a win condition in Wild, as the overall quality of cards included in decks is significantly higher, and the pool of dragons that it has access to is diluted relative to Standard. Nevertheless, it is still just an extremely strong value card in terms of stats generated on 9 mana. With Forged in the Barrens, Highlander cards are once again no longer present in Standard, and I would expect this to be the case for at least a few expansions. Although the Highlander archetype is very popular among players, it does tend to dominate the meta of certain classes in Standard when it's available, so it can be nice to have a break from Highlander decks every now and then, in Standard at least. In Wild, the archetype is as strong as it's ever been, with Reno Priest still being particularly strong, and other archetypes always seeing some experimentation. Overall, I think Highlander has been a great addition to the game of Hearthstone, as it opens up completely new deck building possibilities, and encourages the use of cards that otherwise might not be quite good enough to see play in a traditional deck. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. Consider leaving a like and a subscribe if you really enjoyed the content. It helps the video get out to more people who also will hopefully enjoy the video. I've been doing a couple of little mini vlogs at the end of these videos, kind of airing some of my concerns and that sort of thing, so I thought I'd do that again here. people have asked about sort of the lack of a backing track or the lack of background music while I'm doing the video. It's hard to find one that kind of matches the atmosphere that I want for the videos, and I've been looking and I found ones that I think I want, but they're always ridiculously expensive to license or near impossible to license, so that probably won't be happening anytime soon. But instead of that, what I thought I would do is I'm really into listening to movie soundtracks, so I thought I would include in the description maybe a notable movie soundtrack that I listened to while I was writing this video, and you guys can have a listen to it. Maybe you'll find something new, maybe not. Some of them are very popular, but yeah, if you love movie soundtracks or that sort of stuff, leave a comment below. What's your favourite one? And yeah, thanks for watching all the way to the end. So check out that video in the description if you want to. Leave a comment, let me know if you like these kind of mini vlog type things at the end of the video, and I will see you in the next one.